This was deliberate falsification of the past. To them, it's a war. They are guardians, defending a certain version. These are written by a good historian who knew what he was doing. And these others are wrong. Well, that guy was drunk, or he just made stuff up. Anything that contradicted Scaliger's version of history was purged. They were carrying out the authorities' commission.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the channel Conspiracy Theory with Denis Simonenko. Today my guest is Gleb Nosovsky, candidate of Physical and Mathematical Sciences, professor at Moscow State University, and co-author of the new Chronology together with Anatoly Fomenko. Gleb Vladimirovich, hello. My first question is this. Let me clarify for viewers who may not be familiar, or only vaguely familiar with your work. As I understand it, the main idea is the following. There exists a chronology of historical events that was established, if I'm not mistaken, in the 16th century. Its authors were Joseph Scaliger and Dionysius Petavius. Although many well-known figures, such as Mikhail Lomonosov and Isaac Newton criticized it, nevertheless it was adopted as the foundation. Today it is considered dogma. You challenge it, and you have certain grounds for doing so. Before we move on to the main ideas, I'd like to know a little about how you came to this conclusion. When and how, under what circumstances, did you realize that the currently accepted chronology of historical events is incorrect, and why did you decide to fix it?
I joined the research on the new chronology in 1981. By that time, Anatoly Fomenko had already been working for several years on chronology issues and had created the global chronological map, in which he identified three major shifts in world or rather Roman history, as well as biblical history. In essence, from the standpoint of research, I came to a place where the groundwork was already laid. So, it's better to ask him how it all began and why he came to this conclusion. I don't want to answer for him, since that was before I joined the project. As for myself, I can say that I first heard about Fomenko's work on chronology from fellow mathematicians. This was right after I graduated from the Moscow Institute of Electronics and Mathematics and began working at the Space Research Institute. As a mathematician, as a specialist in probability theory, I found it very interesting. Another reason was that I already felt some distrust toward history. That suspicion dated back to my school years, when I was a student and took part in various Olympiads. In about the 6th grade, I even participated in a history Olympiad. I remember that Olympiad very vividly, as if it were today. There was a classroom, and everyone was given the same assignment. The problem description was as follows. The ancient Greeks greatly revered the goddess Demeter. That was the problem description, period. From this, you had to picture and describe life in ancient Greece. They revered the goddess of fertility Demeter, so please tell us how the ancient Greeks lived. I was a bit taken aback by such an assignment and handed in a blank sheet. I didn't write a single word. I was very curious to see how anyone could possibly derive an answer from that kind of problem description. Usually, after an Olympiad ends, the best paper is read aloud right away. So, we finished, handed in our sheets, and the historian, somehow, I don't know how, within just a minute managed to find the best work in the pile. He read it out. It was an essay, about 10 to 12 handwritten pages long. It described in great detail the life of the ancient Greeks, how they fished, how they hunted, how they traded, and so on and so forth. It amazed me. At the time, I couldn't put it into words. I was still just a schoolboy, but I was always drawn to logic, to science. That kind of approach struck me as very strange. Today I understand it for what it is, pure fantasy. Back then I didn't call it that, but I was deeply shaken. I realized then and there that I would never devote myself to that field. And that was it. I kind of forgot about it. Well, not forgot exactly, I remembered, but it wasn't on my mind. I had other interests. I was studying mathematics, attending Moscow's mathematical school No. 2. Later I graduated from a college, majoring in probability theory, and went to work at the Space Research Institute. Then I heard about Fomenko. I actually knew him quite well, because I had attended his specialized math courses at Moscow University. In particular, I had heard his lectures on topology. I attended several of his courses. When I heard that Fomenko was claiming that ancient Greece had never existed, at least, that's how it was presented to me. Fomenko says ancient Greece didn't exist. I immediately recalled that story from my school days. How many years had passed? I was in the 6th grade back then, so maybe 10 years, or even more. I was very intrigued and asked to see some kind of outline of what Fomenko was actually saying. They brought me a 100-page abstract. Fomenko had written this summary, a 100-page digest of his ideas and results in the field of chronology. It was typewritten abstract, though it was essentially based on his handwritten notes. Back then, there were no computers yet. This was 1981, people used typewriters. That's the form in which I got it, and I read it. They only let me have it for a single day. I read it through and realized that there must be something very serious behind it. I wasn't prepared to believe at once that history contained such radical shifts and parallels. Still, I knew and respected Fomenko. That didn't mean I accepted everything immediately. When I got home, I went to my bottom bookshelf and looked for some brief history book, something that wouldn't take too long to read. I found one, Machiavelli's History of Florence. The first chapter was devoted to world history, starting from the creation. Of course, the book itself was about Florence, but the opening section was a brief universal history. It wasn't a large section, and I thought, this is just what I need. 50 pages, I can manage that. I'll check whether it's really possible that history contains such significant shifts and parallelisms. This looks suspicious. Could it really be that bad? I began reading, and at first everything seemed smooth enough. But then, after a while, I realized that I had already read about the same event earlier in that very book. I flipped back a few pages, and sure enough, there it was. The exact same event. In one place, it was described briefly, in passing, while in another, it was expanded upon in detail. I had Fomenko's tables of chronological parallels at hand. I looked at them, and yes, according to those tables, the two eras lined up. Although Fomenko hadn't even mentioned these particular episodes in his abstract, I could see the match for myself. And that's when I realized, yes, this is something serious. Things like that don't just happen by chance.
So, just to follow up, we're talking about repeated events, the same historical figures presented under different names. As I understand it, one of the main arguments here is the letter X or the symbol I, which you explain as meaning Jesus Christ, or Jesus, or Christ, and that later it was read as the number 1, which shifted history by 1,000 years. What other key arguments do you make?
Please don't put the emphasis wrong, because that's not one of the main arguments. It's more of an elegant observation, but it's not central, not one of the pillars. The real arguments are the mathematical methods that allow us to reconstruct chronology, to find the parallelisms, or, when it comes to astronomy, to get precise dates. Those are the foundations for us. Everything else is more like supporting material, including the X and I idea. The problem is that people without a mathematical background often don't really grasp what these mathematical methods are about, so to them it looks like things like the X and I argument, or some kind of linguistic twist, are the big deal. But that's not the case at all. It's important to understand that the new chronology is a scientific field, and its core is scientific methods. These methods were first developed by Nikolai Morozov, and later his approaches were put on a modern footing. And then Anatoly Fomenko proposed entirely new methods on top of that. Morozov did a huge amount, but his methods were still pretty intuitive. The thing is, probability theory as an actual science really took shape only in the second quarter of the 20th century. Morozov was working right around that time, even a bit earlier. The axiomatic foundation for probability theory was laid by Kolmogorov in the mid-20th century. Fisher and Neyman were working in the 1920s and 1930s. Morozov's work came before that. He was basically at the level of Bernoulli's ideas from the 18th–19th centuries, when probability theory was still in its infancy. So, he couldn't really formalize his methods in a properly scientific way. The probability theory didn't exist yet. But his insights were absolutely on the mark. He relied a lot on intuition, but his intuition was sound. By the end of the 20th century, though, the field needed a more rigorous scientific treatment, and that's what Fomenko did. Like I said, he also came up with entirely new methods that Morozov never had. Taken together, those methods allowed him to build a global chronological map. By the time I joined him and started working with him, that map was already done. I came over to his place with some of the guys he'd invited to help out and offered him some new ideas that I thought could contribute. He listened carefully, asked me to put it all down on paper, and I did. That was back in 1981, and from that point on, we worked together. Since then, we've accomplished a lot, developed many new methods, built out detailed parallels, created reconstructions, and so on. Today, this is a fairly advanced scientific field that's interesting not just to scientists but also to the broader public. As always, any new scientific field first kind of matures inside a small circle of specialists, and only later, when it has solid and interesting results, does it start to attract wider attention. The new chronology has reached the point where it's become interesting to everyone. We have things to say not only to scholars but also to everyone. But it took decades. Fomenko started in around 1973, so that's already 50 years. I've been working with him since 1981, 44 years. Basically, it's been a lifelong pursuit. Of course, it's not our only work. We both had main professional jobs, but alongside that, we've devoted our lives to this and accomplished a lot. Sure, there are still gaps. We don't claim to understand everything, but overall, we do have a clear picture of history now. In general, we understand this well. And it's gotten to a point where it even connects with the present day. In other words, knowing the new chronology helps make sense of what's happening now. That realization came only recently when we saw a certain bridge form between the history we work on and current events. Even though we don't study modern history, we draw the line at the mid-19th century and don't go beyond that. But nevertheless, even if you know the new chronology and our reconstruction of history up to the middle of the 19th century, then much becomes clear about the present day. We don't write about that part. It's up to readers to figure out for themselves.
If we talk about the 1,000-year chronological shift in history, then what conclusions does this mathematical analysis actually lead to? Maybe you could outline the main ones.
There are many conclusions. We've built a reconstruction of history. You see, there's chronology, and then there's history. Chronology is the foundation, the framework. History is built on top of chronology. And then there's the body of sources that have come down to us. But it's all distorted in one way or another. We don't have perfectly accurate, first-hand accounts of the past. Historians like to present the matter in such a way that we supposedly have direct evidence from contemporaries. As if some eyewitness sat down, wrote about what he saw, and today we're reading his actual words. But that's just not true. Everything was copied and recopied many times. Even if in some text it says, "I saw Julius Caesar." Julius Caesar looked at the battlefield and thought. And then you get 2 pages of what exactly Caesar supposedly thought. Historians want us to believe that in such and such a year Julius Caesar literally thought those 2 pages, word for word, exactly as written. That's nonsense. Pure childishness, really. Clearly, someone much later wrote that text. A kind of half-literary invention of what Caesar might have thought. And you can tell it's late because those texts are usually very verbose. The kind of writing you get only once paper was cheap, ink was plentiful, and people had lots of time. So, the key point is, we're dealing with distorted and contradictory information from the past. Contradictory even within itself. You'll find texts that directly contradict one another. Historians say, these are the reliable ones, written by a good historian who knew what he was doing. And these others are wrong. Well, that guy was drunk, or he just made stuff up. Or a medieval artist, say, painted the Virgin Mary, the Annunciation with the Archangel Gabriel appearing, and the whole thing is set in a royal palace, with luxurious courtly costumes. Christ himself is painted in royal robes. And historians just wave it off. Well, medieval painters didn't understand anything, they just painted nonsense that popped into their heads. But there are thousands of such paintings and altarpieces. Historians still insist. No, we know how it really was. Listen to what we say, this is the truth. The truth is in our books, and all these medieval artists and medieval writers write lies. Some of them tell the truth, but others just tell lies. So, in a nutshell, what's really going on here? It's a filtering of information. Historians have their model of history, their concept. Whenever information comes in from the past, they check it against their concept. If it fits, they say, this is a valid source. If it doesn't, they dismiss it. This is nonsense, medieval ignorance, unreliable opinions. In other words, they filter information into what fits their idea of history and what doesn't. But the thing is, it's not because they're bad people. This is just how it works. Contradictory data can't be pieced together into a reconstruction without some guiding idea. You need a thread to follow, a model of what really happened. And then, relative to this framework, we can divide the sources into correct and incorrect. And that guiding thread is provided by chronology. So, if there are two different chronologies, historians have Scaliger's chronology, and we have the new chronology, then these are two different guiding threads. According to one chronology, we declare certain sources to be authentic and others not, while historians do the opposite. They also like to say, behind us are libraries stuffed with genuine documents from the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries. Here are the originals, look, these are the originals. Some emperor, say Charles V, wrote them, and we have them right here on the shelf. To which we reply, you don't need to show us huge shelves and libraries with hundreds of authentic documents. Just give us one original from the 16th century, or one from the 15th century, that you can actually prove is authentic. Just one proven original is enough. We don't need thousands, we don't need millions, one will do. But when it comes down to a specific document, a whole bunch of questions immediately comes up. Why is it considered original? Is it really original? And so on.
Sorry, I just want to clarify this point. Does this mean there is, in fact, no proven case of an original from the 16th century? That basically, we don't have any originals at all, do we?
Exactly. We don't have originals that are easy to read, that can be presented, and from which one could extract something about history. We may have some originals from the 16th century, coins, for example. Those are originals. Possibly some economic records. But all of that has been thoroughly checked, cleaned, and filtered. In other words, anything that contradicted Scaliger's version of history was purged. Understand, this wasn't some random process, it was a deliberate process. It was systematic censorship over hundreds of years. People didn't just get confused about history. Like somebody misunderstood something, somebody else made a mistake. Here people are sitting, figuring out that someone made a mistake. That's not how it happened. No, this was deliberate falsification of the past. Sure, there were chance mistakes too, and many of them. At first there was confusion, and then came deliberate falsification. It was a combination of both causes. They got confused for objective reasons, because the old calendars and dating systems were messy. That's one reason. But they got confused like that in the 15th, 16th centuries. By the 17th century though, it had turned into a commissioned project. Taking advantage of the fact that history was murky and full of contradictions, they fabricated it on demand. And the sources themselves were written to fit the narrative. That's why the number of supposedly authentic sources from the 17th century is enormous, because they destroyed the sources they didn't like. There are only a handful of them left, which were declared to be wrong. Meanwhile, the sources that suited them were backdated and written in the 17th century. Dates were simply inserted. That's why there are so many of them, and why libraries are stuffed with them.
Gleb Vladimirovich, if we talk about the motives, it's worth pointing out that history was rewritten very much not in favor of the Russian Empire, of the Russian state. We know a lot about ancient Rome, ancient Greece, about things that supposedly happened long before the birth of Christ. But at the same time, we know almost nothing about our own history. You could say our statehood supposedly begins only when the Varangians came and founded a state for us. Because, as the story goes, we couldn't organize ourselves and do it on our own. Is this connected to the fact that history was rewritten specifically against our national history?
How do I even answer these questions? They say that once Peter the Great was staring at a map, thinking, and finally said, God created only Russia. That's his famous saying. There's no such thing as national history. Before the 17th century, our national history and world history were one and the same. You see? Our national history before the 17th century is basically world history. It's the same thing. So, when we say that our national history was distorted,
it turns out it wasn't just distorted, it was stolen.
They stole our history. They twisted history. They distorted world history. They changed capitals, changed names. They shifted events from one place to another. Many things were altered, but in general, what is known is known. The facts themselves weren't necessarily hidden, but dressed up differently. That's why I would recommend reading our reconstruction. We have a simple, introductory series of books called Russia and Rome. Not the old edition, which came out a long time ago and is now out of print, but the new slim volumes. The first is Russia and Rome, how it all began. The second is Russia and Rome, Christ. The third is Russia and Rome, after Christ. The fourth is Russia and Rome, the Great Conquest. And the fifth is Russia and Rome, the Cross and Gunpowder. So far, 5 volumes have been published, covering events up to the late 14th century. These are written in a popular style, without the heavy proofs. It's not easy to shift your mindset from the framework that traditional historians push, to the framework that follows from the new chronology, from scientific chronology. Because new chronology is a scientific chronology. It's based on scientific methods and on the level of today's science. What we can extract from the information that has reached us from the past. And that's exactly what we're doing, extracting it with modern tools. Meanwhile, historians are stuck with the methods of the 16th, 17th centuries. They don't have a single method that wasn't already known back then. You say that historians use Scaliger's chronology, but they don't even understand how Scaliger built it. Scaliger actually wrote several volumes where he explained his premises and calculations in Latin. They've never even been translated into Russian. In fact, none of Scaliger's works have ever been translated into Russian. And that's how they study Scaliger. But if you read him, you see that he uses a lot of astronomical calculations. And astronomical calculations are very tricky, because many of them are unstable. If you run them carefully today, you get a result plus a margin of error. What does unstable mean? It means you can do the math and come up with a number. This result is perceived as an exact number. This is an approach from the 16th century. Today we understand that these calculations involve certain astronomical constants, with something being divided, multiplied. But those values are not known with complete precision. Such calculations need to be checked for stability, or, more precisely, their margin of error has to be assessed. In other words, when we obtain a number, the question is, with what accuracy did we obtain it? In Scaliger's case, the error margins can range from hundreds to 1,000 of years. You might get a date, plus or minus 1,000 years. So what? And yet he treated it as exact. Let me give you an example. When Johannes Kepler discovered his laws of planetary motion, he actually falsified the observational data. He needed the data to fit a theoretical curve, but of course the data didn't fall exactly on it. They fluctuated around it, because observations always contain errors. So, he adjusted the numbers so that they matched the curve perfectly. If such a paper landed on our desk today, we'd call it a fake right away. This can't be. Observational data can't perfectly match a theoretical curve. Errors are inevitable. But in the 16th century, people thought differently. If your data deviates even slightly from the theoretical curve, then your theory is wrong. They must match exactly. You see? There was no concept of error theory back then. Instead, there was the idea of perfect calculations, a perfectly designed world, divine precision. That's how they viewed calculations, and everything else. Those ideas are gone now. Today they seem ridiculous. But back then, that's how people thought. Scaliger worked within those assumptions. That's why his calculations simply need to be rechecked. And that's exactly what we're doing. He carried out astronomical computations. Today we know much better how to do this. So, let's take his results, see what he calculated, what he arrived at, and verify them. In the end, it turns out his calculations are flawed. They're flawed not because he added 2 and 2 and got something other than 4, but because he misjudged their accuracy. What can I suggest? If you, the viewer, have some kind of higher education in the natural sciences, you can read our books with the methods we use and judge for yourself how valid they are. You can also read the historians' responses and see that in essence, they don't address the methods. Their objections boil down to a few postulates. We have the sources, and the sources are authentic, therefore we're right. And mathematicians shouldn't meddle in someone else's field. But we're not meddling in someone else's field. Chronology is not a foreign field for us, it's a native one. It's actually foreign to historians. They don't really work with it. For them, chronology has been downgraded to the category of auxiliary historical disciplines. But in reality, it's the foundation of history, and for them these are auxiliary historical disciplines.
Gleb Vladimirovich, it's interesting that there are candidates and doctors of historical sciences. Some of them also try to argue that history has been falsified in certain places. They say, let's take another look. Yet the reaction is still extremely negative. In your opinion, why is that? Why now? After all, one might think that if 300 to 400 years have passed, maybe it's worth revisiting some points, correcting mistakes, even rewriting things. Why such an extremely negative reaction? Your works are branded pseudoscience, and it even comes close to criminal prosecution.
I'll try to answer this question, though the answer may be a bit long, because there are a lot of prejudices tied up in it. What is history, really? Let's start with that. Is history a science or not? Let's consider that first. In our country it is treated as a science. We have candidates and doctors of historical sciences. But if you look at it abroad, which is interesting, let's take the English-speaking world as an example, though it's not the only one, just the largest. There, history is not regarded as a science. They have science, and then they have history, which falls into a category they call speculation. Speculation in English doesn't necessarily have the negative connotation it does in Russian. It simply means plausible reasoning, arguments that aren't demonstrative or strictly proven. What do historians in the West do? Essentially, it's court poetry. They engage in plausible reasoning. Unlike science where there is proof, in this kind of reasoning the field is limitless. You can go in this direction, or that one, and it can all be made to sound plausible. Their guiding thread is the glorification of their society and their state. That's what they do, and they're paid for it. Society is pleased, it's being praised. And people aren't machines. They need a sense of self-satisfaction. We all want to be praised in some way. As the famous poet once said, a deception that elevates us is dearer than a host of low truths. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's just human nature. So that's what they do. And it's a normal activity. It's not paid lavishly, but it is funded by society and the state. They earn their bread honestly. Western historians, Chinese historians, they all earn their bread honestly. With one exception, our historians. Among all the others, our historians are the odd ones out. They believe they're scientists, not speculators, not people dealing in plausible narratives. They speak the truth, as they understand it. And they understand it the way it was passed down to them by earlier generations of historians. They defend it, fiercely. Not a step back. To them, it's a war. They are guardians, defending a certain version. At one time, that version was commissioned. They were carrying out the authorities' commission. That commission is long gone now. But out of inertia, they keep carrying it out. It's comical. Of course, unlike others, they're not in the habit of praising their own country. because, supposedly, the truth forbids it. They can't go against the truth. They believe they have another kind of truth. But again, that's a deep misconception. What is truth, and how do you seek it? That's what science is for. Science is about methods. Scientists search for truth and develop ever-evolving methods for discovering truth. But these people are still stuck in the notions of the 16th, 17th centuries, digging with ancient shovels. So, the point is simple. Our historians are stuck in the past. Completely stuck. They need to make a choice. Either they should accept their role as court poets, and I don't mean that as an insult. Court poetry has its place. We need court poetry. Every state needs it. Every society needs it, and that's fine. So, they could take their rightful place as court poets, just like all foreign historians, and do the same kind of work. Or, if they don't want that, then they need to become scientists. Which means that university history departments would have to teach completely different subjects, grounded in real science, and historians would need proper scientific training to do actual research. But they do neither. That's what history is here. A furious defense of their postulate that they hold absolute truth. That's their defining trait, absolute truth, their certainty. But in practice, it's just like that history Olympiad. Pure speculation. They start with a concept they take as absolute truth, and then they spin fantasies within that framework. That's all they do. That's why we can't have a dialogue with them. They don't want to deal with calculations, chronology. That's boring to them. And fine, they're humanitarians. If it's boring, then it's boring. But then stick to court poetry. Do what everyone else does. Tell stories about how great we were, how we were the best. We'll be happy to listen, even if it isn't true. But telling us how backward we supposedly were, without any scientific methods to back it up, only their own certainty that they know the truth. Sorry, that doesn't work. Yes, back in the Romanov era, there was indeed such a state-commissioned narrative. The Romanovs were Germans. So naturally the narrative was, everything good comes from Germany, and everything here was backward. They justified their rule that way.
You'd think that in Soviet times they would have been interested in revisiting that narrative. But for some reason, it never happened.
Why? Because for all those communists and Bolsheviks, history began in 1917. Everything before that was some kind of legendary past. And it's still like that. They're not interested in what happened earlier. Well, maybe they are, but only as something secondary. What really matters to them is history after 1917. For example, what do we celebrate on February 23rd? The creation of the Soviet Armed Forces. And when were our armed forces created? Look it up, in 1918, or something like that. That's the history of our armed forces. We celebrate February 23rd because there was some event when they were created. And it's the same story across the board, you see? So that's why the communists weren't interested in pre-1917 history. They just weren't. A few historians sat around working on it, telling stories about how the masses were oppressed. And that was all that was expected of them.
I'd like to circle back to the substantive part of our discussion. In your works, you often emphasize that it wasn't only chronology that got shifted, but geography too. You point out that on medieval paintings, which you've mentioned. Jerusalem is shown with lush greenery, and people are wearing sheepskin coats. You also connect biblical events with the Black Sea, and in particular with Crimea. What role did Crimea play in these events that were essentially erased from our history?
The history of Crimea is very important and very interesting, but I'm afraid I can't go into it in depth right now. Because to understand that, one needs to know our reconstruction. And our reconstruction of Crimea's history differs radically from the conventional version we're used to. If I start explaining it now, we'll get lost in the weeds. I just won't be able to explain it properly, you see? Not to someone who hasn't studied our reconstruction.
Well, at least in a few words to spark people's interest in your work on Crimea.
There are some great, global events tied to Crimea. Christ was born in Crimea. He was born on Cape Fioland, in the Cave of the Nativity. In other words, Crimea is the birthplace of Christ. That's one of the most important events. It's no accident that during the Crimean War in the 19th century, the British called it the War for the Manger of Christ. Historians have their own explanation of why they called it that. I won't repeat it, but that was the name they used. And it was the right name. Crimea is the manger of Christ. What else can be said about Crimea? According to Russian chronicles, Osman, the founder of the Ottoman dynasty in the late 13th century, was a Crimean ruler. Historians don't accept that. But the Russian chronicles say so. That is, he was a prince in Chersonesus. Later, his dynasty, his descendants, came to power in the Islamic world. That's why, by the way, there was a law in the Ottoman Empire that if the Ottoman Sultan's dynasty died out, power would have to pass to the Crimean Khans. And if you know history, that's true. The sultans would spend their summers in Crimea. They had their summer residence in Double Anchor Bay, near Feodosia, where they vacationed. Feodosia is actually Caffa, the Kiev of the Chronicles. It was there that the Apostle Andrew appeared. A lot is connected with Crimea in history.
In one of your works, you even make the surprising claim that Kiev might have actually been Caffa, today's Feodosia.
The princes of Vladimir, Novgorod, and Kiev. We remember that Russian history begins with a dynasty being invited to rule. And that really happened. A dynasty was invited, but of course not from Scandinavia. They came from Tsargrad on the Bosporus. It was a royal dynasty. And the meaning of this invitation wasn't that we had no order in our land. Our land is great and rich, but there is no order. Let's invite someone. No, Misl actually said it differently. By the way, it's in the Chronicles, that's how it's written there. Misl said something else. Yes, our land is great and rich, but it is ruled by princes, and the land is so vast that it must be ruled by tsars. So, we must invite a royal dynasty. Later it would mix with ours, and we would be tsars, not princes. In other words, the level of our rulers was simply too low for such a country. That's what Misl actually said. And that's exactly what they did. They invited in a royal dynasty, Rurik, who was also Aeneas. From then on, Russia was ruled by tsars, not princes. It was a very smart, very correct decision. Let me repeat once again. Russian history and world history are one and the same. At least starting from the 14th century. It was from Russia that Eurasia was colonized. When they invited the royal dynasty, naturally, they began building an empire with its center in Russia. Now they had a pretext to conquer everyone and to rule from their Russian capital. Before, there were just princes, who didn't have the right to do so. But now there were tsars, who did have that right, even though they intermarried with the locals, and in essence the dynasty became native. But in direct lineage it was still royal. Civilization itself wasn't created in Russia. Sometimes we're accused of claiming that everything began in Russia. That's not the case. First, in ancient times, civilization was created in Egypt, then on the Bosporus. After that came a time of turmoil. Following that turmoil, around the time of Christ, part of the royal dynasty, not all of it, since it was very large, moved to Russia and founded a new dynasty. That was Rurik. From then on, tsars ruled in Russia, who entered into a struggle for world dominance with other branches of the royal dynasty sitting in different places, mainly in the south, mainly where the empire had first taken shape, the Black Sea region, the Bosporus. To wage that struggle, they needed a base closer to the action. That's why they took Caffa, Kiev, and made it their second capital. It was a very smart move. Their main capital was in Novgorod, that is, in Yaroslavl. In fact, Novgorod is Yaroslavl, in the Volga-Oka interfluve. It was a huge natural fortress. From the west it was hard to get through. Dense forests blocked the way. Back then, movement was along rivers. The mounted army that would later conquer the land routes of Eurasia hadn't yet been created. Travel was by water, along the shores. From the west you couldn't get through, and the route to the Bosporus, to the old imperial centers, ran down the Volga, then a portage to the Don, and then to the Sea of Azov and the Black Sea. That was the water route. From Russia you went downstream, and from there, back to Russia, you had to fight the current. This asymmetry gave a big advantage. When a Russian army moved toward Tsargrad, it went quickly downstream, struck fast, and after victory could return upstream at its own pace. But when an army from the Bosporus, from Tsargrad, moved toward Russia, they had to travel against the current. That slowed them down and gave time to prepare. There's not a single recorded successful campaign that way. Once, in the 16th century, a sultan tried, but they couldn't make it. They ran out of time before winter set in, the Janissaries mutinied, and they had to turn back. By contrast, there were many campaigns from Russia toward the Bosporus, some even described in the chronicles. But to wage war in the south, they needed a capital closer to the action. That's why Prince Oleg founded, or seized, Kiev, also known as Caffa. It was their fortress, because the Kiev we know today gives absolutely no advantages. It's cut off from the sea by rapids. It has no strategic military value at all. But Caffa was a real threat to the Bosporus. From there you could launch raids. And if the enemy struck back, you could retreat, go back to Russia. A very smart move. And so, they entered into the struggle, and won it. After the time of Christ, in the 13th century, they spent 100 years preparing and built up a huge mounted army based on Russian resources. What resources? Iron, in vast quantities. There was no steel yet, just plain iron. The iron legions of Rome that conquered the world. They had plenty of iron, plenty of fuel to smelt it, since you needed charcoal. In the steppes between the Volga and the Don, vast herds of horses grazed, and war horses could be bred there in huge numbers. Because war horses aren't raised in stables. The very best, the fastest horses are chosen from herds. People talk about the Arabian breed. What, did it just come out of the sands or something? Nonsense. All those breeds were originally bred in the steppes between the Volga and the Don.
I have a question. What was the reason behind the necessity to write history in the 16th, 17th centuries, starting from ancient times and ending with the 16th century? Also, it's surprising why lands had to be discovered again in the 15th, 16th centuries, as if nobody before then knew about the existence of America, or about other lands, or about India, which our countryman Afanasy Nikitin visited in the 15th century. Why did they decide to compile a history? Did people really have no knowledge of their own past?
Why do you think so? India was known. Why do you think America was known before the 15th century?
There are certain facts indicating that the Vikings were there. After all, Viking settlements and ships were found on the American coast. Let's talk, for example, about writing history. Why? Was nothing known about our past?
According to the new chronology, there had only been coastal navigation before. Ships capable of venturing into the high seas only appeared in the 15th century. The compass came even later. So, we don't dispute that America was discovered at the end of the 15th century, maybe a little earlier. That's a correct statement, and here we have no disagreement with historians.
I see. And what about the writing of history?
We don't argue with historians on everything. We don't say they're wrong about everything. We never claim that. They have many correct statements.
What caused the necessity to write history in the 16th, 17th centuries? So many things were unknown?
It was the restructuring of the world. The world was reorganized. Again, I can't explain it all in a few words right now. You need to read our books. What I want to say is that Soviet historians used to claim that all history is the struggle of the masses against oppressors. Maybe the people did struggle at some point, but they didn't write anything about it. The masses were illiterate, and our history is written history. All the sources that have come down to us are either court or monastic sources, which had no interest at all in the struggle of the people with someone. The history we study through written sources is the history of power, written under power, by representatives of power, and about power. Therefore, we as mathematicians relying on information and not on speculation, can only investigate the history of power, not some other kind of history. Because power, since ancient times, left us information about itself in the form of written sources. This is precisely what we can estimate and study. Nothing else can be studied. In reality, the history of power, in broad terms, is very simple. There are people in power. There are many of them. They fight among themselves. Someone sits on the royal throne. There was one empire, meaning it was one common state. Of course, it wasn't strongly centralized, since there was no telegraph or telephone. Distant provinces were more or less independent. But the czar could at any moment arrive, hang a bad ruler on the gates, and appoint another. This often happened. Above him, and above everyone else, hung the sword of Damocles, even for those who lived far away. They had to travel to the capital, bring gifts, and so on and so forth. There were dark days for the supreme rulers. At times, they were overthrown, not by the masses, but by other members of their own extended family. Then they would flee somewhere, hide, and try to return to power. That was the history. An extended family that ruled the world, whose members fought among themselves. Some would take the throne, then be overthrown, hide somewhere, and start plotting their return. They'd think something up, organize a rebellion, a coup, and attempt to come back. Not always successfully. That's the essence of history. In reality, world history is the history of the struggle of elites. And it's still like that today. Yes, empires sometimes collapse. The empire collapsed. It happened several times. It fell apart at the end of the 12th century. Then they spent 100 years preparing and rebuilt it in the 13th century. At the beginning of the 17th century, it collapsed again. It's roughly like the collapse of the Soviet Union. If you know, members of the Politburo became rulers in their own territories. The same thing happened there, exactly the same scheme. Governors turned into independent rulers. They had to prove on paper that they had always been independent rulers. That their fathers and grandfathers had also been independent. For this, it was necessary to write a history in which the empire was erased, the centralized power was erased, and in each country sat its own independent ruler, a descendant of an ancient dynasty that supposedly ruled there. That's what they did in the 17th century. At the same time, the czars who were driven from the throne in order to break it all apart, didn't actually disappear. They remained. They and their descendants are still around. They are trying to piece everything back together again. And they are piecing it back together. One last thing I'll say. They claim that there is a Russian and a Western civilization. Let's say America. Let's take America. There is America and Russia. Two different countries, two different civilizations. They are completely different. But here's what I'll tell you. That Western world that was being built in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, Western civilization, at the head of which in reality stands America, was founded on principles that arose in no less a place than Russia at the end of the 16th century. It was Russian czars who began building this Western civilization at the end of the 16th century. And they were building it quite successfully. But they were driven from the throne, they left, were forced to hide in England. And from there they began to build the state they had originally been constructing in Russia. In Russia it didn't work out, so they built it in the West. And now they intend to return to Russia with the very same order of things that had originally arisen in Russia in the 16th century, only with a 400-year break. All this is simple. In other words, history is very simple. If you read the new chronology, you'll see that it's not that complicated. It's much more compact, much simpler, and more natural. Historians have turned it into a heap of something heterogeneous and hard to grasp. Just some unsystematic pile. If you look at history, that's exactly how it appears. A shapeless mass of facts. But in reality, it's an orderly structure, simple, not very large, based on simple laws. That's what I want to say.
Thank you very much for this interview. A reminder, Gleb Nosovsky, co-author of the New Chronology, candidate of Physical and Mathematical Sciences, professor at Moscow State University, on the program, Conspiracy Theory, with Denis Simonenko. Subscribe to our channels, as well as the New Chronology channels. Links will be in the description of this video. All the best, goodbye.